now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online booksellers everywhere today. A comic shop owner who has been in business for 30 years was verbally castigated by Marvel Comics senior editor Tom Brevoort, DC Comics Editorial, and many comic professional writers and artists after he made a viral video that made a statement about the dire state of the comic book industry.
Most of these new writers don't have the love of comics like these older writers had. And all they care about is, how can I put myself in the book? No, we don't care what you would do if you were Iron Man. We don't care who you are. You're writing Tony Stark. You're not writing yourself in a book. If that's the case, write your own comic with you in it. No one will read it because nobody cares. People grew up, are growing up loving Peter Parker, loving Miles Morales, loving all these Captain America. We don't need you to put your input in it. Just write Steve Rogers. Don't write Steve Rogers. What would Steve Rogers be if I was Steve Rogers? That's not how it works. But that's again how most of these new people write nowadays. That's why most of the stuff is shit. Because we don't care what you would do, because we don't care about your life whatsoever. Just write a book, get paid for what you do, get paid for what you're supposed to be doing, and make it a good story.
Now, in this video that went viral, comic shop owner Glenn O'Leary, who owns the Comic Book Palace in Massachusetts, expressed his frustration with the poor quality of the writing being published at Marvel and DC Comics. Now, according to Glenn O'Leary, he states that most of these new writers don't have a love of comics like the older writers had, and many of these writers, all they care about is how they can put themselves in the book. Now, Glenn O'Leary further goes on to say that these writers, they want to write themselves as Tony Stark and Steve Rogers and Peter Parker, and don't want to write these characters as they were. And as Glenn O'Leary made his observations about the dire state of the comic book industry's lack of creativity, he was derided by Marvel editor Tom Brevoort and many creators such as Jamal Igle, Gail Simone, and Jimmy Palmiotti, who went into ad hominem attacks after Glenn O'Leary made his observations regarding the dark state of the comic book industry and the lack of creativity between the pages of most modern comics. Now, as a publisher myself, when I heard Glenn O'Leary's statements and the reaction to them, I just had to shake my head, because this whole response from comic publishers was extremely unprofessional. Now, here is a person who is out here selling your product, and instead of showing that man respect for selling your product and telling you what is wrong with the product, what Marvel's editors and these comic creators did was instead go out here and attack a person who is going out of his way to sell their products inside of his store. Now, as I see it, Glenn O'Leary is a better indicator of what is actually going on as related to sales, because right now he's someone who is on the ground and can tell you what is actually selling at the comic shop right now. He's a guy who comes in every day and sees his regulars coming in with their pull list, which continues to get smaller with each passing day due to the numerous cancellations, numerous reboots and relaunches, and there being no way to keep anything consistent to measure sales. He's an indicator to what's actually going on and knows what's actually selling, because he sees what's leaving the shelves of his comic shop. And as someone who sees what's leaving the shelf of his comic shop, he is a better barometer to measure actual sales, because the whole system of measuring sales has been just thrown completely off because we no longer have measures, because nobody talks about the book sales as related to comics with Comic-Con anymore. I mean, there's no Comic-Con listings anymore. Moreover, we don't really have a true measure of sales like Nielsen Bookscan has for trade paperbacks like I Sell on the SJS Direct imprint. So the only person who can tell us what's actually selling is a comic shop owner like Glenn O'Leary, who is on the ground and sees what moves out of his store. But instead of listening to somebody who is actually on the ground and can tell you what can sell, what we get from many of these people in editorial, like Tom Brevoort, is denial. Now, when I was working at Strive Job Readiness Workshop as a part of AmeriCorps Vista, one of the trainers there talked about denial. And what denial is that you don't even know you are lying. And this is the type of behavior that addicts participate in when they don't want to acknowledge that there's a problem. And it's clear to me that Tom Brevoort, as an editor and an executive, really doesn't need to be in the job, because if you cannot acknowledge a problem, then you are not an effective editor, because an editor's job is supposed to be the eyes and ears of the public and be able to assess the problems. And you would think he would want to assess those problems, because that is a major part of his job. But no, what Tom Brevoort wants to do is deny the problem by saying that the industry is changing. And yes, the industry is changing, but it has been changing for the worse for the last, I say, about 30 years. And it's changing for the worse because we are now near a period where the industry is about to collapse. Now, I mean, when Glenn opened his store back, if it's 30 years ago, 1993, the industry was in a very good place back then. I mean, in 93, I was out here, I was in college, I was buying a lot of books from Marvel and DC and Milestone, which just came out. Plus, you had companies like Image out here producing a lot of indie books that were selling over 1 million copies. Moreover, we also have the start of the toy collecting market and people buying action figures like many of the figures you see behind me, the early 5-inch figures. So a comic shop owner could make a very good living back in 1993. However, the industry really started its decline after the death of Superman, and then in 1994, when Marvel decided that it wanted to go out here and copy Image and go all extreme as related to its art, and started changing up many of its characters with horrific storylines like The Crossing. And as Marvel was going out here creating these extreme comics, they were also looking to go out here and buy the distribution of comics with Heroes World, a decision that continued to bite Marvel in the ass, because what happened with Marvel was they found out that when you go into distribution, a lot of those books get returned and they started taking losses. And this is what led to Marvel going on the road to bankruptcy and started the slow decline of the comic book industry, a decline that really started to get worse even after Marvel managed to get itself right with Heroes Reborn and Heroes Return in 2001 and 2002. That is where we started to see the second stage of this decline, where comic editors were changed at Marvel and DC, and instead of putting seasoned professionals in those positions, what happened was we got 2 inexperienced individuals in charge at Marvel and DC. Now, over at Marvel in 2001, what happened is Tom DeFalco wound up leaving, and what we got was Joe Quesada in editorial. And when Joe Quesada came to editorial, he had no real publishing experience, and he had no real experience outside of the limited self-publishing experience he had with his Ash comic book and a couple of covers that he did for DC with a couple of comics, but he didn't have that seasoning as related to being able to manage and navigate a large catalog of publications, and didn't know how to assign talent or assess talent, And that's what really started Marvel's decline in 2001. And the same thing happened in 2002 when Dan Didio, a Hollywood executive, was brought into DC Comics. And when Dan Didio was brought in, again, he had no publishing experience. And because he had no publishing experience, what happened was he basically started DC, which was selling consistently, to go on a huge road to decline with his same extreme type stories that he got from these deconstructed story model of Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. And that's what really started the decline at DC. And Marvel was in decline, and they were in decline creatively because instead of giving us bright stories that gave us hope and action and adventure, we started to see a push of the deconstructed story models at both companies, with stories like Identity Crisis and Civil War. And those stories wound up alienating lots of readers who started to walk away from both the Marvel and DC brand because they were tired of the extreme graphic violence, as tired of the extreme gore, as related to mutilating characters and murdering characters constantly. And that's where we started to see the industry going from six-figure sales to five-figure sales, and things started to go bad. And as DC and Marvel kept trying to right the ship with events, what happened was the sales continued to drop until what happened in 2011 led to the complete decline of DC, where Dan Didio decided to end the DC universe, which he basically derailed with his poor editorial decisions, with his death, blood, and guts story model, to going out here and looking to reboot the DC universe. And with that reboot of the DC universe to the New 52, yes, there was a short-term spike in sales, but sales quickly started to plummet because many longtime comic fans began to abandon the DC brand, which was the foundation which kept many comic shops afloat. And over at Marvel, they were still struggling as related to their platform. And this basically was the thing that really started many comic shops to really start to see much of their regular customers start to leave. And as things continued to decline, we started to see not only the comic shops suffering as related to sales of books, but they also started to suffer as related to all of the merchandising, because after 2011, all of the action figures like you see behind me started to not sell as frequently as they used to. I mean, I remember when DC Universe Classics was hot and basically flying off the shelves along with DC Direct figures and Marvel Legends. But what happened was a lot of these shops started to suffer because people started to walk away from both Marvel and DC because they didn't like the way that these characters were being written and being done. So they started to abandon in numbers around after 2011. And then as we got into 2015 and 2016, that's when the decline turned into a free fall because DC was doing the convergence, and then Dan Didio derailed the rebirth over at DC, which was trying to get DC back on track, and Marvel decided to go and push the all-new, all-different Marvel. And sadly, at both companies, the big problem at both of them is something Glenn O'Leary has basically pointed out, that instead of hiring people like myself who wanted to come into the industry, who cared about the characters, had a passion and a love for the characters, what they did was recruit a lot of people who had no real writing experience, and even worse, no real life experience. And because these people had no real writing experience or life experience, they didn't know the character of Tony Stark or Steve Rogers, or I even say Bruce Wayne or Clark Kent. And that's by design, because at that time, the editorial at Marvel and DC went out of their way to say, oh, we don't want fanboys writing our books, not understanding that many professionals like myself were not fanboys. No, I was a person who, back when I was a teenager, did extensive research on these characters. Even though I was collecting comics, I wanted to know the backstory of those characters so that if I were assigned a character, I could be ready to go out here and start putting fingers to the keyboard and be able to write a story that would make it where we wouldn't be able to miss a step if a writer wound up changing. Because what I saw back in the 90s was when a writer changed, like when I saw when Len Kamenetsky left Iron Man and a new writer came on named Terry Kavanaugh, the entire book's dynamic completely changed because the writer was not up to speed. Whereas even before that, in the early 90s, when we had William Messner Loebs on The Flash and Mark Waid took over, with William Messner Loebs left and Mark Waid took over, you couldn't tell a difference as related to the styles because Editorial made sure to enforce the standard of house style. Whereas in 1994, over at Marvel, you could tell that this writer really wasn't on point, but the editors at Marvel, they were so caught up in trying to compete with Image and its Flash that they didn't understand that when it comes to Marvel and DC Comics, you need somebody who knows these characters like the back of their hand, somebody who knows the history of these characters, somebody who understands, the story of these characters, somebody who has passion for these characters. But instead of looking to hire an individual like that, like myself, what we saw over at Marvel was a lot of these people looking to hire somebody based on their feelings as related to how they felt about these people without ever checking out their background, without ever checking out their publishing credits, without ever even giving them any sort of training as related to writing in a Marvel house style, or somebody that could go out here and have an understanding of the character of Tony Stark. And because these writers got no real guidance from Editorial, which was inexperienced in and of itself, what happens is these writers don't know how to write, and they don't know how to write about anything because they know nothing about writing. And this is the main reason why we have so many of these self-insert characters, because these writers, being inexperienced writers, what they're doing is projecting themselves onto the characters, because many of these writers have no real life experience and they have no real knowledge of the characters. I mean, one of the things I know as being a writer with over 25 years of writing experience is you can only write about what you know. And these writers, basically being a lot of these writers being first year writers or writers who only wrote essays in college, they don't understand the whole craft of writing. And even worse, you've got editors like Tom Brevoort and many others who have no real understanding of what it means to be an editor. They don't understand an editor's job is to be the eyes for the public as related to the story and convey what the public would objectively say if they read this story. I mean, as somebody with over 25 years of writing experience and over 10 years of publishing experience, I basically just wince when I look at many of the comics being produced today at Marvel and DC Comics, and I don't see any sort of care for craft like I saw with many of the veteran writers that came before today's writers. I mean, when I look at most of these writers today, they really don't do their research. They really don't have a good sense of a character's voice or personality. They really don't know these characters, and what they want to do is write a story about what they would do, like Glenn says, what they would do if they were Iron Man, but that's not what the customer is paying for. No, what the customer is paying for is a story about Tony Stark, and you need to leave yourself out of the story. That's something that I have been doing for over 20 years, is that whenever I write a story like a Isis or a Steam or a John Haynes or a Spinsterella or a Lilith Grave story or any other story that I write, I have to take myself out of the story and let the characters tell the story, because in the medium of comics, it's a character-driven medium, and as a character-driven medium, the characters themselves have to tell their own stories, and it's not my job to put myself in the character story. It is my job to let the characters experience what they experience, because that's the main reason why the reader is buying the book, and that's the main thing that makes the reader care about the book. I mean, people want to see a story about Iron Man that features Tony Stark being Tony Stark, Steve Rogers being Steve Rogers, Peter Parker being Spider-Man, and we want to see these characters as we knew them. We don't want it to be some self-insert Mary Sue or Gary Stu version, because that's bad writing. Because if you are putting yourself in the character's shoes and putting yourself in the character's place, that shows that you're not a good writer and that you're not ready for prime time as related to being a professional writer. A professional writer's job is to go out here and tell the character's story, and whatever happens to the character is what happens, and you're doing this because you want the reader to learn something as related to the story that you're writing. That's a principle, sadly, that hasn't been implemented as related to editorial at Marvel and DC Comics, and that's all due to the inexperienced editors that are in place. These inexperienced editors are the reason why we're getting so many poor quality comics. And as Glenn O'Leary makes this statement, instead of listening to him, what happens is people in the comic book industry went out of their way to attack him, and them attacking him again just showed how unprofessional these individuals were. And what's really sad is that many on Comics YouTube have made these same observations, and instead of again looking to support those customers and those people who've been buying comics, what we've seen in the industry is people attacking the customer. And when you attack the customer, what happens is the customer winds up not looking to support the product. And that's what hurts Glenn O'Leary's comic book palace. I mean, this man has spent 30 years building a business, and he's the one taking the loss at the end of the day as related to most of these poor selling comics. And even worse, he's seeing that he's getting no support from many of the publishers who he goes out of his way to go start selling their products. I mean, that's a middle finger thrown up at a shop owner, and I would think that Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney should step in and apologize to this man for the disrespect he's received. I mean, here's a man who went out of his way to just express himself, and here these corporations, you have staff here disrespecting a vendor. And this is something that if I was the CEO of Disney or the CEO of Warner Brothers Discovery, I'm going to have to go out here and have a talk with Tom Brevoort and many of the professionals who are on my payroll. But that's not being done, and that is the saddest part. That shows us how sad the state of affairs is for the comic book industry. I mean, this is a completely sad state of affairs for an entire industry, that you have a business owner being disrespected straight to his face, and instead of there being professionals on the executive level at Disney and Warner Brothers Discovery to go out here and rectify this situation, what we get is this man derided with ad hominem attacks about his appearance, rather than talk about the sad, dysfunctional appearance of the comic book industry in comparison to the overall publishing industry. Now, the publishing industry right now is in a bit of a sales slump with books. I mean, I've been struggling to sell books all year, and I know how that can affect your business, because this is how this man pays his bills. So I understand what's going on here as related to his business, and I understand that the way he's being treated is reprehensible. I mean, I would never do this if I was able to get my books in shops. I mean, when people were telling me they didn't like the covers I was doing because I didn't have any money, I went out here and sold a lot of the collectibles I had in my collection on eBay so I could be able to start paying for covers. And thankfully, people have donated money to help me continue to pay for covers. But I tried to respond to people by letting them know what the problem is and work towards solving it. And sadly, a billion-dollar business like Warner Brothers Discovery and Disney isn't thinking that way about comics. And that's why the comic book industry is in a dire place, because instead of showing respect to all of those people who invest their time and money in selling comics, what they did was throw up a middle finger at a comic shop owner during a time when comic book sales are at an all-time low, and a time when we're seeing hundreds of comic shops closing across the country. I mean, we just had Jim Hanley's and Village Comics here in New York wind up closing due to the poor quality of the merchandise, and the response from Marvel editor Tom Brevoort is to say the industry is changing and not acknowledge that it's changing for the worse. And that really shows the state of denial that the editorial at Marvel and DC are in. The only place you can get a comic book from is a comic shop, and there are less and less comic shops out there. But instead of showing that you're going to try to help a shop owner who's telling you what's wrong, what you do is attack him. And that's not what you do when it comes to the business of the customer. I mean, as somebody who has been in business for a decade, I can tell you that when it comes to the customer, you listen to the customer, and the customer is the one who's paying the money. So you try to listen to the customer and let them know, okay, I hear what you're saying, and we're going to try to get this right. And I don't know if there's any time to get anything right, because another comic shop owner I've heard of said that this industry basically only has 2 years left in it, and I would have to agree with them, because when I look at the way this business is treated its customers and treated its fan base, it's just reprehensible. I mean, you don't treat your customers like this, and you don't treat your business retailers like this by leaving them with poor quality product. No, you go and you try to improve your product. That's not being done, because what's happening is that Marvel and DC don't want to pay experienced writers, because experienced writers are going to remain consistent and not consistently want to push the message along with their self-insert avatar characters. These self-insert avatar characters just don't sell comics because they don't answer the critical question I have to answer before I put my fingers to the keyboard, and that is, why should we care? Why should we care about a self-insert character when we want to see Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Peter Parker, and the characters everybody grew up with? I mean, I don't care about these Marvel comics now because they aren't like the ones I grew up with back in the 70s and the 80s. No, they are just absolute dreck, and they've been dreck, I'd say, for a good 20 to 25 years, ever since the Heroes Reborn started to fall apart in 2000, because I came back around them. At that time, we had Kurt Busiek leaving Iron Man, and that was the start of the second decline of Marvel, a second decline that nobody at Marvel wants to acknowledge, because we have a lot of guys who are out here. They're basically, as I see it, workplace simps, and these workplace simps are in denial as they're out here running a fiefdom, caught up in the clout of saying, oh, I work at Marvel, but the work they're doing is far below the standard of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who are able to sell hundreds of thousands and millions of comics year after year. But these people can't even sell 5,000 or 6,000 comics at a month as related to their books. And we have somebody who is on the ground who can measure the numbers, but they don't want to listen to that owner because he's not attractive to them. And what's even less attractive to them is the truth. And they can't stand that Glenn is holding a mirror up at their face, showing them the truth. That is what they cannot stand as related to Glenn, as related to him talking about comics. And he's just telling the truth about this business, a business that has been in a decline for, I'd say, a good 30 years, and now is in its final stages of collapse. And he's out here sounding this warning, but instead of listening to the warning, what we get is more denial. And when I look at the comic book industry, sadly, it's like the Roman Empire doesn't want to listen to the truth until it's too late. And sadly, I think the only thing that will help these people hit rock bottom, which is the place many drug addicts and alcoholics wind up in, is them seeing their entire industry have no place to sell their comics. I mean, that's going to be the rock bottom for many of those like Tom Brevoort, is seeing a company like Warner Brothers Discovery or Disney winding up laying off its entire division, maybe then they'll see the rock bottom that Glenn is trying to warn you to avoid. But right now, we have these people like alcoholics and drug addicts in editorial in denial about the state of the comic book business, a business that struggles basically every day because many of the people working there are inexperienced as related to business. And again, I'm not going to say the word woke because the word woke is something related to black people who have their eyes open and are aware. But what I see is the inexperienced leading the inexperienced. And like the Bible says about the blind leading the blind, all of these people are falling into a ditch. And what's happening now, because we have these blind leading the blind, they are leading the comic book industry straight into a ditch that it will not get out of because we've lost 2 to 3 generations of readers, and we lost the biggest opportunity to reach an audience with the MCU. The MCU basically handed the comic book industry a new audience on a silver platter, but instead of being in a place where it could capitalize on it like we were able to in 1989 with Tim Burton's Batman, which brought lots of readers into comic shops, many of the editorial at Marvel and DC weren't able to jump on that whole opportunity because they were out here pushing Riri Williams as Ironheart and pushing Sam Wilson as Captain America, losing the audience that was watching Tony Stark, Peter Parker, and Steve Rogers on the screen, and missing an opportunity to reach a new audience of readers. Again, blowing it because you had inexperienced people in charge who pushed message over content and quality of content. So when I look at this whole situation over at Marvel and listen to this owner's passionate pleas going on deaf ears, I was deeply saddened by this because here's a man who is on the ground in Massachusetts. Here's a man who's on the ground in the store seeing the books being sold. Here's a man who is passionate about comics like I am, and sadly, the people who are passionate about comics are on the outside. Meanwhile, the people who don't care about comics are on the inside, and that's the sad thing that has hurt the industry since the 90s. I myself have been trying to break into this industry since the 90s, and I could not find a doorway in. And that's that's one of the reasons why this industry is struggling right now. Many of the people who have passion and care for these characters, who have love for these characters, it breaks our heart to see these characters go out like this. But we wanted to be here. We wanted to be a part of this business. And as a writer, as somebody who knows the craft of writing and honed his craft of writing outside in writing trade publications, it hurts my heart to see that a seasoned writer like myself cannot be out here putting fingers to the keyboard for many of these characters and sharing them with the next generation and possibly helping get the sales of a shop like this one up, because what gets people into the shop are talented people who have a care for the characters. We can't get to the shop, get to write these characters, and what's happening is these characters are being written out of the annals of pop culture history in an ignominious fashion, and they're being written out in an ignominious fashion because most of these companies would rather have these characters as corporate properties rather than have people write stories that resonate to the people out here who used to enjoy them. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available in paperback on Lulu.com. And if you want to check out a comic in the way I write a comic, you can find that on Lulu.com for the same price as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter. And if you want to try out my first digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, you can find that comic on Kindle.com for 99 cents. And you can get a paperback version in my book, Esteem Blast from the Past. And you can find many of my other fantasy fiction books on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, the books of the Spinsterella trilogy, my vampire novel, Eternal Night, my black sorority novel, The Thetas, and my Black Business Novel Recipe for Success, you can find all of those books on paperback and Kindle format on Amazon.com, and you can also find them at other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and you can also find many of my books at online retailers like Walmart.com and Target.com. And if you'd like to help me be able to produce the next full SJS Direct comic, you can send a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. And if you also want to help me be able to support many great indie creators like I do with making book comic video reviews by buying their comics, you can drop a donation to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App as well. And I use a lot of that money to pay comic artists for book covers, and I also use it to go out here and support independent comic creators as related to getting their books to the marketplace and do great comic reviews. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu. John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers. E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman. Hell's aspiring angel takes on a wicked werewolf in this action-packed, all-new E-Steam series adventure. Get E-Steam Horror of the Hyena Woman in paperback and e-readers today. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.